Well, good evening and welcome to what promises to be a very, very interesting discussion between David Herman and Mira Hamermesh's son, Jeremy Coopman. I'm going to leave it to David to introduce Jeremy very shortly, but we'll just say that this event marks the centenary of Mira's birth, and I remember her well. I didn't know her well, but I remember her well and vividly as being a formidable and extraordinary creative personality. So I very much look forward to this. I think many of you will already have come across David in one capacity or another, so I'll keep it very, very brief. But he was a TV and a radio producer for some 20 years or so, working with the likes of Melvin Bragg, Jeremy Isaacs, and Michael Ignatieff, a sort of a stellar array of figures, specializing in the arts and talks and history programs. Since then, he's worked primarily as a freelance writer, writing many hundreds of articles and reviews for a whole array, again, of very prestigious publications: New Statesman, TLS, Guardian, Independent, Jewish Quarterly, etc., etc. He's served as a trustee for the Ben Uri Museum and Art Gallery, also indeed the Jewish Quarterly, and most recently, and importantly for me, he's one of a much valued trustees of the Insiders Arts Outsiders Arts Foundation, set up to provide, sort of formal backing to the Insiders Outsiders project, which, as most of you I think by now will know, is dedicated to celebrating the very extraordinary and diverse achievements of those who found sanctuary here from Nazi Europe to this country's culture. And of course, Mira is very much one of those people. And last but not least, he's also the son of the wonderful artist who, again, I had the very great pleasure of knowing reasonably well, Joseph Herman. And I'm hoping that David indeed will tell us more about the close friendship that existed between Mira and Joseph. So with great pleasure, over to David.
Monica, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. As Monica said, this year is the centenary, Mira's centenary. Mira was a Polish Jewish refugee and one of the leading documentary filmmakers of her generation, and we'll look at her work in more detail as we go on. But we'll start with her extraordinary life, because she did have quite an extraordinary life, and which she wrote about in her memoir, The River of Angry Dogs. And I'll be talking to Mira's son Jeremy about her life and distinguished career. And we'll talk for about 40 minutes and then throw things open to questions from the audience. I just want to begin with one particular story from her memoir, which really captures a lot of a sense of her experience during the Second World War. In 1959, her memories of the war caught up with her. She'd gone to the Academy Cinema in London to see Wajda's film A Generation, which had been made in 1955, one of the first great films of the Polish New Wave, set in Warsaw during the German occupation, the Nazi occupation, I should say. And it brought back terrible memories of the German occupation of Mira's hometown in 1939. Throughout the film, she wrote in her memoir, I had to push my fist into my mouth to muffle the sobs, overcome with a belated sense of loss. I had to suppress an urge to howl like an injured animal. The film, she said, had torn open old wounds. It exploded my defense system, a makeshift survival kit devised to release me from my accountability to the dead. Before we get to the war, Jeremy, perhaps you could say something about her childhood and her background, who her parents were.
Yes, she was born in Lodz, in 1923. A fairly middle-class family. Her father was an entrepreneur, had a small rubber factory, traveled widely, or particularly to the UK. They had a very comfortable, I think, middle-class existence. They had a very nice flat in the middle of, or close to the center of Lodz. She had an elder brother who was about 5 or 6 years older than her, and a sister who was about 4 years older, Genia. Brother was Mordechai Mietek. Father was a good-natured, optimistic sort of person, according to Mira. Mother was more of an anxious, sort of slightly worrying presence in her life. And I think Mira had more of a complicated relationship with her mother, but got on very well with her father. I think in the book she says her father loved gadgets and new things that he brought back on his trips to Europe, and Mira certainly had the same kind of habit of picking up the latest gadget that was around in the UK when she lived here. So she went to school, local school. I can't work out from her memoirs whether it was a private or a public school, but she seemed to have had a fairly normal background. She was obviously a bit of a dreamer, a creative young person, and everything was going normally until September the 1st, 1939.
And in 1938, just before we get to the war, there was one moment, which was, well, perhaps you could talk about.
So in 1938, her sister Genia, who was a young Zionist, went to then Palestine. She was 18, so she could go without her parents' permission. And she went to an agricultural college called Ben Shemen, so to be train as a tyro farmer. She was actually in the same year as Shimon Peres, so it was an interesting time. And so that proved to be both, yes, a very lucky intervention unknowingly from her sister by moving to Palestine. So she left in 1938, and a year later, obviously, the war broke out.
And then after the war broke out,
yes,
Mira makes a life-changing decision.
She decides that she is going, she says in her book, River of Angry Dogs, that with her brother, and she says on Yom Kippur, but I'm not too sure whether this is true or not, that she is in a bar with her brother. She's obviously she's only about 16 at that time, so sort of picking up classes. And she says she overhears a couple of German soldiers saying, "We're going to get rid of these Jews." And obviously she takes it literally, or it makes an impression, and she decides, she says there and then, that she's going to try and leave Poland and try and join her sister in Palestine. So she gathers a few friends of hers from school, and they sort of set up a plan. They're all going to leave, and they're going to forge identity cards, which she does from the school. But the other 4 or 5 school friends drop out one by one, so she's left on her own, but she's still insistent she's going to go, and manages, this is extraordinary, persuades her parents actually to let her go as long as her brother goes with her. So her brother probably about 21, so a young man, and they do indeed agree to go, or the parents agree to let Mietek and Mira go, and they leave in November 1939, sorry. And they take a train to Krakow. They meet some more people along the way. Their plan was to cross the river. Then obviously Poland's divided into Nazi-controlled Poland, and then on the other side, Soviet-controlled Poland. And their story is their family is in Lvov, and they are trying to reach their family back in Soviet-occupied Poland, and they cross a river in the middle of the night, hence the title River of Angry Dogs, because of the sound of gunfire all around them. And they do indeed make it to the other side, where they are quite shortly arrested by the Soviet troops. But so she does manage to escape. I think that probably, I've just realized that maybe the heroes, the story of the parents who allow them to go. I mean, who would allow it turned into a very prescient decision, but imagine allowing your 16-year-old daughter to try and escape Nazi and Soviet troops. Extraordinary.
And Jeremy, what became of her parents?
Well, I suppose in about February 1940, obviously the Lodz ghetto was created, Lippmannstadt. Both the parents were sent to the ghetto, and the mother died of starvation in 1942, May 1942, and her father was on one of the last trains to Auschwitz. So he perished in Auschwitz in 1944. Luckily for Mira, her mother was actually buried in the Lodz cemetery in Lodz. So very few, she had one of the few cemeteries, not cemeteries, but tombstones actually in the cemetery. So there is a tombstone from that time in the middle of a meadow there. So.
And before we continue with Mira's extraordinary journey, when did she find out about what had become of her parents?
I think obviously after the war, or maybe I think when she arrived in, probably when she arrived in Israel, in Haifa in 1949. But I mean, she wouldn't, obviously, that was still early. I think she says as immigrants were turning up from Europe in Palestine in 43, 44, it was then that she was beginning to understand what happened. But very interestingly, she did, and we'll come to this later, she makes it to Vilnius, but she did correspond with her parents. It was, yes, as I said, she made it luckily to the Vilnius, and there she managed to correspond with her parents in the ghetto. So there's a whole load of postcards that she managed to keep, which certainly kind of revealed the suffering that they were experiencing. Didn't obviously, predict what their ending was. But,
and Vilnius was then still
Lithuania, still in. It was actually an independent. It was still independent. Yeah.
And then after Vilnius?
So I mean, just to fill you in, so they made it to Lvov. At one point, she tries to escape to get to Palestine via Romania. She gets arrested. She gets sent back to Lvov. She decides she'll try and, I mean, she's staying with some family friends in Lvov, but she feels she can't stay very long with them. Then she tries to go to Lithuania, Vilnius, which is then independent, and she does in fact manage to make it across the border between Poland and Lithuania, between Soviet, obviously controlled Poland and Lithuania, where she's looked after she stays there for about a year, and she's looked after by Jewish charities there.
And when you say is she still with her brother at this point?
No, her brother, when he was in Lvov, he decides he's going to sort of be patriotic and be a miner in the Donbass region of Ukraine. So to sort of work. So the family that he's staying with, one of the sons say they must be patriotic and become miners and work for the Soviets. And he does that because he thinks that it might help getting his parents freed from Poland. Somebody has told him that if he works as a miner, that will make it easier to get his parents freed from Poland. He goes to the Donbass, he leaves the mine, he doesn't like it very much. He gets arrested by the Soviets when he tries to go into Lithuania, because he's heard that my mother has managed to arrive there. He tries to go there himself. He's a very good skier. He tries to ski across the border, and then he's arrested and he's sent to Siberia, where he doesn't spend too long there. He's liberated after the Nazis invaded Soviet Poland, or Soviet Union.
So Mira is now about 17. She is separated.
Now 17. So in Vilnius.
Separated from her brother, and her sister, of course, is still in Palestine.
She's living with about 100 or so other exiles, refugees in Vilnius in a hostel. So there are a whole lot of young people in this hostel in Vilnius, and she actually goes to school there. She studies. She makes some friends. So she's not totally alone. She manages to correspond with her family in Lodz, from the ghetto. I think she sends a letter to her sister. She is in communication with her sister. Her sister at this point is trying desperately to get a permit for Mira to enter Palestine. Obviously, there are now restrictions on how many Jews can enter Palestine. And Genia is going from Ben Shemen to Jerusalem knocking on the doors of the youth aliyah saying, please get my sister a permit. And she actually decides she doesn't have much luck. She goes to the home of the head of the aliyah in youth aliyah in Jerusalem, Helen Sol, and manages to persuade her directly to get a permit for Mira to enter Palestine. So a very precious permit. So that's
now,
how
I don't
she...
know, Jeremy, about your sense of European geography, but I'm guessing that from Vilnius to Palestine is quite some journey. So,
in February 1941, she goes with a whole lot of other people from Vilnius. So there's a party of them. And they go to Moscow first. Then they go to Odessa by boat, I think. Then they go to Bulgaria. Then Istanbul, Damascus, Lebanon. So they I thought originally maybe they took a boat from Istanbul to Haifa. No, but they go across land, Damascus, Beirut, and finally managed to take a taxi from Beirut to Haifa, where she's met by her sister.
And how long does this epic journey take?
This is, I think, just about a year. So she arrives in about April, probably 1941. So she's left in 1939. She must have spent about a year in Vilnius, a year and a bit. Probably took a month to travel from Moscow to, or from Vilnius to Haifa. So yeah, it's a year and a bit.
And so there she is in Haifa. And what does she do with, and she's reunited with her sister.
Reunited with her sister. They both go, her sister takes her to Ben Shemen. So Mira kind of works a little bit, studies our culture. It's clearly not for her. She manages to get a place in a school in Tel Aviv, a Polish gymnasium. She obviously, is learning Hebrew at that time, but she's always exhibited talent as a painter. She's always painted. She's had she's always drawn. And she manages to get a place in Bezalel art school in Jerusalem. So she moves to Jerusalem. That must have been about 1942, 43, where she would have been about 20. And so she lives in Jerusalem. She's studying at Bezalel Art College, has an exhibition in 1943. So she's doing quite well as an artist. And I think has a second exhibition in sort of around 1946, which is sponsored by the British Council. And at that time, she manages to get a scholarship to study at the Slade School of Art. So sort of supported by the British Council.
Jeremy, before we go on the next stage of her journey to England, we should catch up with what's happened to her brother in the meantime.
Exactly. So her brother has been freed from the Siberia. He joins up with the Free Polish Army. So he becomes a soldier. So he's fighting with them. I don't know whether he comes with the army to Jerusalem, but or whether he's left the army and gone by himself to Jerusalem. So he's in Jerusalem. My mother is living in Jerusalem. She's always had this idea that one day, she's scouring all these Poles. Will her brother ever appear? Whatever. She's one day in a cafe in Jerusalem, the Faberhof Cafe in Jaffa Street, and lo and behold, a familiar face walks in the cafe, not quite as she remembers, but it is her brother, and they obviously embrace, burst into tears, and he stays then in Israel, and so remarkably, all three of them have survived. So the parents have perished, most of the uncles and aunts obviously perished, but the three children, quite remarkably, have all survived, and they obviously remain very close for the rest of their lives.
And before we continue with Mira's journey, the brother and sister stay on in Israel?
Brother and sister absolutely stay on. Genia becomes a teacher, primary school teacher, lives in Tel Aviv, marries, has two children. Mietek has various jobs in Tel Aviv. Mietek, I probably should have mentioned, Mietek was an incredibly handsome man, very blonde, very blue-eyed. So when it came to leaving Poland and making their way to Soviet-controlled Poland, looking like a kind of an idealized Aryan sort of god, it made life a lot easier for him and Mira, who looked more Semitic, shall we say, dark-haired. So it definitely helped having Mietek as her companion. Nobody could question that he was born in the blood, sort of blue-eyed Polish gentleman or young man. So yeah, he stays in Tel Aviv, gets married, has 2 children, and Genia and Mietek live quite close by. They live in North Tel Aviv.
And we should say, just for what it's worth, that Mira was also incredibly beautiful. And, and part of her tremendous presence as a person was, she was stunningly beautiful, but also very charismatic.
Yes, yeah, I know she was very effervescent, very knowledgeable, a kind of fairly self-taught, and quite, she had a presence and she knew her mind. And she was a kind of, I think she was from, I don't know from birth, but from very early on in life, a very strong feminist. And that kind of continued throughout her life. I don't know what informed that specifically, but she was, she was never afraid to argue with anybody, and she believed herself the equal of anybody, whatever age, sex, or, nationality.
And I should say, I mean, that she was a very important person in my childhood, because my father, Joseph Herman, who was also a Polish Jewish refugee and also an artist, taught her briefly during the 1950s, and they became friends, I suppose, really for the rest of, certainly the rest of his life. He died before long.
Yes, I think the impression I got, I mean, your father was called obviously Joseph Herman, and he was, Mira's father was Joseph Mira Hamermesh. Your father was very much not only a kind of tutor and inspiration, but a father figure as well, having lost her own father. So your father was very important, both artistically and personally as well. And she painted very much in the style of Joseph Herman. You can see your father's influence very much in her painting. She painted peasants. She loved painting sort of sailors in ships. She liked sort of the grittier, poorer elements of life. I think she responded to that. So when she went to Ibiza, she would be painting peasants in the fields and boatmen, sewing their nets, etc. And very dark blues and browns, so quite dark, similar sort of color palette, I think, to some of your father's paintings.
And she was very important to him in another respect, which was that he had lost all his family in Warsaw during the war. And she had lost her parents, obviously, and as you said, in Poland during the war. And I remember when she used to come and visit, when we lived in Suffolk for 10 years, they would speak in Polish mostly, which was very, very important to him. And I remember as a small child hearing these strange words, Treblinka, Oswięcim, Łódź.
Right.
I just thought, what are these places? What are they, if they're even places? Are they people? Are they whatever they are? And I think it was enormously important for him that he had a number of very close friends, of whom Mira was certainly one, who he could speak to in Polish, but also who he could speak to about the losses they both shared.
Yeah. No, Mira, actually, she never spoke to me in Polish, sadly. So I never learned Polish, but there were lots of Polish people who came to visit. She was she was a great entertainer. She loved people to visit. She loved having people to stay. She loved giving parties. I mean, you know, she loved giving dinner parties. She was social. She dressed very colorfully. So there was none of that. You wouldn't know that she'd survived the Holocaust from the way she lived her life. She was flamboyant, you know, and very open. So she spoke, I mean, she was quite a linguist. She spoke, you know, obviously her Hebrew was pretty perfect by that time. She spoke Hebrew, French, a bit of German, from a little bit of Yiddish. I never really heard her speak Yiddish at home. So I don't know whether she spoke Yiddish with her parents. I know probably her parents spoke Yiddish to each other, but I think the children probably spoke Polish to each other. Yeah.
And then comes an extraordinary turning point, because there she is during the 1950s in London, having her first exhibitions. And it looks as if, presumably, it must have looked to her as if she was going to have a career as an artist. And she decides to go to the famous National Film School in Poland.
She does. She's married at that time. She meets my father. They marry in 51. I was born in 1953. As you say, she saw that film, the Vida's, what I can't remember what date, maybe
59, she says.
59. So she saw that in 59. In 59, she decides that she has to go to Poland herself to kind of try and find her mother's grave. And my father is slightly resistant, well, very resistant to the idea, in fact. And obviously, there's not much travel between Europe, the UK, and the Soviet bloc, which is obviously Poland's still in the Soviet bloc. So getting into Poland is still not that easy, but she manages to get a visa. She manages to go to Łódź. She meets some people who work at the film school, who actually accompany her to a trip to the cemetery where she tries to find the grave of her mother, which is unsuccessful. She's intrigued by these people from the film school. I don't know whether there and then she gets the idea that she's going to study film, but she goes to the film school and she asks to see the dean of the film school, and she says, how do I study here? She's obviously fermenting the idea of being a filmmaker. And he explains what the process is. It's obviously going to be very difficult. She's from the West. She tells him that she's going to have an exhibition in London in 1960, or next year, 1960, at the Brook Street Gallery in Mayfair. So she's clearly by then a quite accomplished painter. And he says, "Oh, well, I'm due in London round about that time. I'll come and visit and see your exhibition, and maybe we can talk further." So that's actually what happens. She returns to England. He visits the exhibition. He's impressed by her painting. He offers her to come for an interview to Lodz, and she gets a scholarship. She gets a place there and moves there in term time. I'm at a boarding school at that stage. So this is 1961. I'm at a boarding school in Kent. So she goes during my term times and comes back during the holidays. So she studies there for about 4 years.
And we should say, because it may sound sort of bizarre that she's gone to this smallish in Poland, but not only is it her hometown, of course, but also there is this incredibly exciting Polish new wave of film directors.
Well, no, what I forgot to mention, actually, the film school is in Lodz. It's the National Film School, and it is internationally renowned. It's renowned as one of the best film schools in the world. At that time, there wasn't really a film school in London. So if you wanted to study film, you'd probably have, film as opposed to television, you'd probably have to go abroad. So, she was lucky it was in Lodz and in her hometown. So, the planets aligned, so to speak.
And she makes a number of films in the 4 years that she's at the film school, of which I've only, I'm ashamed to say, seen one, which is called Lesson 2, which was her diploma film in 1965. And it's a 20-minute film. It's a short film in black and white, in which a group of Soviet prisoners are questioned by their German guards, and there'll be a literacy test. And those who pass will be given clerical work, and the illiterates will do labor. But there is, as the title suggests, a second lesson to be learned. And without exaggeration, I would say it is one of the greatest short films I have ever seen. It is one of the greatest war films I've ever seen. It's incredibly powerful. So, I mean, quite clearly, she had tremendous talent as a film director.
That's very true. It actually, she starts out, her very first film she makes there is actually filmed in the Lodz cemetery. So it is a group of people carrying coffins in the Lodz cemetery. So the first few films are kind of very inspired by what happened to her parents. The next film is called Holy Family. It's about as if the Holy Family was in the Holocaust. So, you know, Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Then she made a film called Homecoming, which is people coming back to the homes that she's left, they've left. But you're right. Lesson two, it was a big, you know, for a student at the film school, a big feature. She had a big cast, you know, lots of camera equipment. It was filmed in the dead of winter. It was quite a challenging film to make. I mean, you know, just technically, it was quite difficult to make. And she got lots of uniforms and managed to get some soldiers as extras. Yes, she never quite. I think she often would have liked to have made a big feature film, but it never. That was a big feature film. But yes, very successful. Right.
And then another extraordinary twist. She goes back to Israel.
That is later on. Well, what happens is after the film school, she comes back to the UK. She does actually a film that she made at my prep school called End of Term, that which was run on British television. Can't remember whether it was the BBC or ITV, but it was a full-length documentary. It was about doing a summer play, The Tempest, in my prep school, and it was quite a lovely film. Then she does yes. Then you're quite right. That was in kind of '67. In '68, she's invited by Israel Television, who are just setting up at that point. They've invited a few foreign specialists to help them set up Israel Television, Channel 1. And she comes in as one of a kind of handful of directors to help them make some documentaries. And she stays there about a year and makes about 4 or 5 documentaries, many of which are very good indeed. She made one called Fighters of the Ghetto, which was closest to her heart, about a kibbutz in northern Israel that was set up by fighters of the ghetto, and they have a museum there. And that was a very good film.
And why did she then come back to England after that?
Well, I think she knew it was only a temporary job. I mean, after that, by that time, Israel would have had their own film directors and producers and whatever, and all the foreign specialists went back to where they came from. So she comes back to the UK, does a couple of films here and there. She does a film for Thames Television called Two Women, about a woman in Hungary, about a sort of middle-class woman in Hungary and a working-class woman in the north of England. She does a couple of other small things, but she's pitching all the time, but hasn't really made her mark in British television.
Well, I think one of the things that happens when she makes this film, as you say, this documentary, Two Women, in the 1970s for Thames, and I'm guessing that's when she comes across Jeremy Isaacs.
Correct, absolutely, yeah.
Then what happens in the 80s is that under his patronage, I'm assuming, I may be wrong about this, but I think under his patronage, when he sets up Channel 4 in the mid-80s.
1982, yeah.
1982, she suddenly starts making, she makes about half a dozen. Really?
Yeah, between, yeah, obviously, I think Jeremy is a supporter. Liz Forgan, who was the director of programs, I don't know how much they knew each other. She was editor of the Ham and High, the newspaper in North London, so they might have met. But she pitches them with some ideas, and the first one they accept is a project called Maids and Madams, which is about the relationship between, it's about apartheid South Africa's relationship between the white madams and their black maids, and the sort of fraught relationship between the two. She tries to get permission from South African authorities to make this film. She's commissioned by BBC, by Channel 4, sorry, to make it. She tries to get official permission from the South African authorities. She's turned down, but nevertheless, she decides to make it independently. She just goes as a tourist and hires a film crew there and makes this film, which is set in Cape Town, in Soweto, and they just managed to film, make this documentary, sending out the rushes every day, and they do it under the noses of the South African authorities, which she was always incredibly proud of. That she actually succeeded in making this documentary. It was a 60-minute documentary. It was very successful, won numerous awards for Channel 4. In fact, one of
not least, I mean, the Pre-Italia,
yeah,
Television Society Awards. So, I mean, these are major
award. Yeah, the Pre-Italia is the Oscar of documentaries.
Yes, absolutely, and I think confirmed her relationship with Channel 4, because to win 2 awards like that, and maybe other awards as well, I don't know, but to win awards like that, plus this link with Jeremy Isaacson, possibly Liz Forgan, and so on, you know, I think meant that she really was sort of on the inside track at this point. And then
absolutely,
some other documentaries, both for Channel 4 and the BBC.
Yeah, so after that, she made Talking to the Enemy, which was a wonderful film about a Palestinian woman living in Washington and a much older Israeli kibbutznik, who were both part of the peace movement, had met in Washington, had corresponded, and Mira made a very moving film about a Palestinian woman coming to the kibbutz and meeting with the family of the kibbutznik, and looking at where she used to live in Jerusalem, and a very, very, very moving, very, in the light of what's happening today, Talking to the Enemy, probably a very apposite, still very current, sadly.
And one of the other, yes, absolutely, and one of the other documentaries she makes for the BBC in '91 is Loving the Dead, which is one of my favorite of her documentaries. I don't know if you'd like to say a few words.
Yes, Loving the Dead was probably her proudest achievement, along with Maids and Madams, I think. It was a very, I think, fascinating subject. It was about how does Poland cope with the ghosts of 3 million murdered Jews, really. And so she goes to Poland, interviews people who have hidden their Jewishness, people who are, were Jewish and become Jewish, and she tries really to explore the relationship, the ghosts, really, those 3 million ghosts, of how they react with the Poles and how the Poles react to the ghosts, whether they react at all. So that was a moving. She goes to Auschwitz as a kind of a scene where she recreates parents kind of pleading with her to save them. So it's quite, very much rooted in her own experiences and her imagination of what happened to her parents. So yeah, it was a kind of requiem for her parents.
And she died in 2012.
She died in 2012, yeah.
And how do you think she would have liked to have been remembered? She wrote a very powerful memoir. She made some extraordinary films.
Yeah.
Uh,
Interestingly, I think she, probably as a feminist, I think that was her, her overarching persona. And, she hated, I suppose, inequality. She was, very in favor of social justice. She hated oppression. I mean, all her films, she made another film called Cast at Birth about the untouchables in India. So they were all about oppression. South Africa, India, a little bit of, in Israel. So I think that's how she would like to be, yes, remembered. It's kind of as a feminist and a fighter against oppression.
And as a mother?
As a as a mother, yeah, I think probably maybe one of her achievements. She wasn't around all that much, or she went to. I was at boarding school when she was in film school, so we had an interesting relationship. But we got on. We rubbed up okay.
Very kind of.
She was a difficult woman, actually. I mean, she did frighten a lot of people. I've read people who've written about her saying, I'm about to meet Mira Hamermesh. I'm really frightened. She's got this terrible. She was very kind of forthright, and she was incredibly forthright, very strong-minded, didn't mind sort of making anybody feel uneasy. She was, I suppose, she was fearless, and that's probably maybe that part of her she should be remembered as. She was absolutely fearless and incredibly strong-minded. If she wanted to do something, she would. She was happy to.
Since this this conversation is part of a series to do with the Insiders Outsiders festival, I should point out that she was a real outsider. She's a Polish Jewish refugee, and at the time when she came back to England from Poland to try and get into television films, it was an incredibly insular, parochial, masculine world. So she was a twofold outsider. She was a woman.
Yeah.
She was a Polish Jewish refugee. And it was an incredible achievement, I think, to have managed to break into that world. Again,
you're absolutely right. Yes, I probably should have. Yeah, no, I probably should have sort of underlined that. When she started, there were very few women film directors. And she was also much older. And, she must have started making films for Channel 4 when she was about 60. So she was fighting lots of prejudices against women, against older people, and she obviously wasn't part of the club. She hadn't made films at BBC. She hadn't come up through that way. So yeah, it took immense kind of willfulness and a strong mind to get her projects accepted. And she's even until into her mid-80s, late 80s, she was still pitching ideas to heads of documentaries at channels all over the world. She wanted to make a film about gypsies. She wanted to make a film about refugees at the UN. She was obsessed about the Holy Family, about the Virgin Mary. She had lots of projects she was working on, and maybe shouldn't remember that probably the thing that one of the things she was proudest of, and she wanted to just got to move ahead with, was a book called Women in War. And she was, writing this massive treatise about the history of women and war, women as fighters, women as mothers, women as being raped, and it was a sort of from Greek times to the modern times. And she spent a lot of her time kind of collecting articles, and she'd written a good part of it. It was kind of idiosyncratic book. It wasn't academic. It was very much informed by her own experience. But she saw herself also very much as a writer, as well as a filmmaker and a painter. So yeah, no, Women in War was probably something she was proud of as well, but which drew together all her experiences of life and art.
No. And I'm just having a little bit of difficulty tracking down questions. Monica, may I possibly ask you, perhaps you can track down?
Yes, I'm not sure if there've been any. They're jolly well.
Oh, that might explain why in that case.
There ought
All
to be.
right.
I mean, what an extraordinary life, and how vividly and wonderfully you've both conjured it up. Thank you so much. Let's let me start the ball rolling, and I've got all sorts of things I'd like to quiz you about. I mean, perhaps starting at the very beginning. I mean, this amazing project that you've just described on women and war. Have you thought at any point about trying to publish it in some form? Sounds such a, it's such an important subject.
Yeah, no, it was only really kind of a quarter finished. So, I have at times kind of presented it to people, would they like to take it on? But it was very much a personal, it was very much intertwined with her own life, her own experiences in war. So maybe at some stage, yes, no, I could publish what she had finished at least, but
has any of it been published at all, even sort of extracts, smaller? No.
She was a very good writer. Her memoir, I really
something to do, on the to-do list.
Published by Pluto Press, and it is because it tells an extraordinary story of this journey, really, which I hope we've managed to convey, against all odds, to get from Lodz to Vilnius to Israel to Palestine, and yes, and just brilliantly told, I think.
It is. I know she was a brilliant writer when writing about herself and doing documentaries. When she tried to do fiction, actually, it didn't have that facility. Interesting. It didn't work as much when she tried to apply herself to writing fiction, imagining herself as other characters. But River of Angry Dogs is brilliantly written. I've recently reread it, and it does read along like a novel, and there's some extraordinary stories in it, stories that she's been told about what happened to people who she met in Poland, in Lvov, in Vilnius. Some terrible stories, some uplifting stories. It's it was a fascinating book, and was very well received. I had some fantastic reviews.
Is it still available? I mean, obviously it's out of print, or I assume it's
available electronically via Pluto Press. Yes, you can.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. No, I remember
River of Angry Dogs via Pluto Press.
Good.
And also, having said that she was an outsider, which I think is right, but I should also say that I think she had a number of strokes of luck where she was in the right place at the right time. So to be in Israel just after the '67 war, when they're setting up their new television industry, and she had connections with Stuart Hood, I think, from the BBC, which somehow helped her.
Correct. Yes, you're absolutely right. Maybe he was connected. Yes, I remember his name being mentioned a lot when I was growing up. She wasn't in Israel at that time. She was in the UK, and then they invited her from the UK to Israel. So that was a stroke of luck. The biggest stroke of luck was getting out of Vilnius in February 1941, just a couple of months before the Nazis invaded and took over Lithuania. So, which obviously would have been the end of her, as against leaving in November '39, before the Jews were sent to the ghetto in Lichtenstein. Her two great escapes. So she had two great escapes, 3 arrests on her journey from Lodz to Palestine.
Jeremy, before writing her autobiography, or indeed as she was writing it, had she talked to you about her wartime experiences, or was it only through writing her memoir that she was able to articulate it?
I think I was aware, because once she writes it in her book, when we were in Ibiza, and I saw she writes that a fly dying upside down. I said to her, "Is that how your parents died in the war?" So I was clearly aware of the story, even if she hadn't sort of told it to me directly. So I kind of knew about it, but didn't really know the details about it until I was much older, actually. So you wouldn't have, I mean, when you say she was an outsider, she actually was also quite well integrated. She spoke English very well. I thought she had no accent. My children told me she had a very strong Polish accent, but she did manage to mix with the high and mighty of, of British society when she had to.
If I could just interject there, I mean, going back to David's comment about the insiders outsiders project, it is deliberately insiders stroke outsiders. It's this kind of creative and often fruitful, tension between being both simultaneously, or sometimes one, sometimes the other. Going back to Poland and the pre-war period, I mean, David, I know from your father's story that actually he left Poland largely, I hope I'm right, I think I'm right, as a result of experiencing anti-Semitism at first hand from the Poles. And yet you're saying, Jeremy, that it doesn't sound as though your mother was exposed to that to the same extent. Am I right? Or
you're quite right. And in fact, in Loving the Dead, that film about going back to Poland, and in her subsequent interviews about it, she's actually quite supportive of the Poles. She says they've actually, they're very often characterized as being virulently anti-Semitic, hating the Jews, and even after the war, there was a kind of, not pogroms, but there was certainly an anti-Semitic movement. But she was, she loved being Polish. She was proud of being Polish. She didn't sort of hide her Polishness, and was quite defensive about the, when Poles were being attacked for being anti-Semitic, even though she had some very good friends who actually left Poland. I've forgotten when that period, probably about 63, 64, a whole lot of Jews left Poland. And she actually got very friendly with Andrew Weider's cameraman, somebody Lippmann, who came to stay with us when, he had to leave Poland, because it was kind of rebirth of anti-Semitism there. But she was very supportive. And she obviously, I mean, she didn't write at all about suffering anti-Semitism as a school, as a young child in Poland.
But I would say that there's a crucial generational difference in that Joseph and many of his closer friends were born before the First World War, and therefore were very political, very left-wing in the 30s, very bound up with a sort of bohemian world, whereas she was, of course, that significantly younger and therefore still at school and so on. When
more assimilated as well, much more assimilated in Polish society.
Yes.
yes.
Or assimilated, more assimilated Jewish. They had telephones, they were quite middle class, they were quite modern. It was quite a kind of, not a wealthy, but a well-heeled existence. They had a maid, a live-in maid. So, they lived a good life.
The impression you get from the beginning, particularly the opening of The River of Angry Dogs, is that she was really haunted by the losses in her family and the losses in Poland in general. And yet, when you met her, she didn't seem, as speaking as a young schoolboy, she didn't strike me as a sort of haunted person, but perhaps she was.
No, I don't. I think mainly she wasn't. I mean, in her persona, she never came across that way. Nobody would have guessed what she'd been through. Clearly it was there, but it didn't it dominated her artistic life, her intellectual life, but not her personal and social life. It was an interesting dichotomy, I suppose. She said nobody knew about what she'd been through, which I find difficult to believe, that she hadn't discussed it with friends. It would have been impossible. I would have thought that the friends she was meeting in the 50s in Swiss Cottage and the kind of in the cafes there, that she wouldn't have discussed what had happened. But she says that it was news to everybody that, when she went back to Poland, why she was going.
And what was that like for her, do you think, returning? I mean, apart from the excitement of the film school itself and that new wave of Polish cinema, but also going back to Poland. What did she talk about that, of what that felt like?
Not to me. All I know about it is from her book. And I mean, there were two standout moments going back to Poland. One, she did locate her mother's grave. So, you know, we all know where it is now. And I've forgotten the second. I'm sorry.
Perhaps we can just shift the focus slightly, because there's a question from Yona Yapu asking where she could see, or where one can see some of her painting. Now, there is a wonderful website, Yona. You can easily find it. It's www.mirahamermesh.co.uk.
Mira-Hamermesh.co.uk.
You'll find it. These days, it's very easy to do, to find it.
Yes, now I've still got a whole lot of her paintings. Monica, you're going to have to help me work out what to do with them at some stage.
No, they're fine.
Sorry, I was just going to say, there's also the question of viewing her films. And I think we decided or agreed that you have to go to the BFI archive.
You have to go to the BFI, but you can email me on her website. And we are going, hopefully, to uplift her films onto the web or the cloud or wherever it's called, so that people will be able to see them. But yes, they can be viewed at the BFI archives.
Yes, it must be rather frustrating. That's right. We're hearing about this extraordinary life and, you know, the extraordinary films and not being able to show clips. But yes, good. Anna and Benjamin, Mira's grandchildren. I don't know whether, I don't want to put you on the spot at all, but would you like to perhaps conclude this evening's event by just saying a little bit about how you remember your grandmother? No, as I say, no pressure at all. But it'd be lovely if you'd like to make yourselves visible, or one of you make yourself visible, and say just a few concluding words. If there's no reaction, I'll retract my
technical problems, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Wonderful. Is there anything else, David, that you wanted to cover? I think we've had a pretty, I mean, I suppose another obvious question, you talked about her interest, preoccupation with the Holy Family, transposing it to the Holocaust context. How did she identify? I mean, I assume she wasn't, you know, you said it was an assimilated Jewish family back in Poland. By my understanding, she wasn't an observant Jew.
No.
Later life, but presumably she felt intensely Jewish in other ways.
She felt intensely Jewish. Went to, I mean, we didn't, you know, we didn't, we weren't observant at home. I can't remember hardly ever doing Friday nights. But she did obviously go, you know, we went to the synagogue on Yom Kippur. Passover, I was usually at school, so I didn't experience that very often. But she was intensely, yeah, I suppose predominantly she, you know, you would know she was Jewish within a minute of meeting. She was always, you know, she was always talking about being Jewish and referencing being Jewish. So it was you know, that was very high on her persona, a Jewish feminist or a feminist Jew.
And as regards her feminism, I'm intrigued, because I'm thinking of my mother, who's exactly the same generation as yours, but she was born in 1924, and she was in many ways a pioneer. She set up a portrait studio at the age of 21 in, you know, just immediate post-war Manchester. And I don't think at the time she actually saw herself as a feminist, but she was a woman and she did it. And I just wonder whether Mira just did things, refusing.
No, she did things, but she also very much saw herself as a feminist.
She did, right from the beginning, do you think?
Right from the beginning, and she was part of kind of feminist groups in London, feminist meetings, and I think actually in the Netherlands she did go to make a short film about a kind of an international meeting of women who were there to discuss, I've forgotten which aspect of feminism, but it was, you know, she was trying to capture it for television, and I've tried to find the rushes of the film, but can't find them, sadly. So yeah, no, she thought herself and she had tons of books about feminism in her library. She was very well read. She had books about women, about war, and about Jews, and those were her three primary interests. Actually, you could read her through the books in her library. And she was a voracious reader.
And Fay Weldon, the writer Fay Weldon, was a very close friend.
Very, as was Alan Sillitoe, and she, I think, yeah, she would have loved to have been a writer. She was very.
And Ruth Wainwright, Alan's wife, the poet.
And Ruth Wainwright, the poet, yes. Yeah. So Alan Sillitoe and yes, Fay were both very, very good friends. They were very close friends. As was Tom Wiseman as well. The you know Tom Wiseman? He used to be was a novelist as well. So she was friendly with many. She loved novelists. She loved writers.
And I noticed that Iona has also set up a message at the BBC third programme. There was an émigré woman producer, Leonie Cohn. And indeed, of course, the third programme in particular was absolutely packed with Jewish Central European refugees, more German and Austrian, I would say. And this would be another way in which she was an outsider, because there wasn't the same kind of Polish network as there was the German and Austrian network of refugees, I think, either at the BBC or anywhere else.
Right.
That was also
actually, the BBC today, they took one of where they took River Angry Dogs and wrote a kind of a play about it, which featured they did a series of stories of refugees coming from around the world, and hers was one that was adapted for that series. I've forgotten what the series was called. It was yeah, so they kind of fictionalized, dramatized a story, had actors playing various parts. It's quite interesting.
No, I remember coming across that. Good. I think we'll call it a day there. This recording will be on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel for posterity, so I hope a lot more people will have a chance to enjoy it. Thank you so much, Jeremy and David, as always. And please, Jeremy, hurry up. Yes, make more of the films available for those who are interested to view, and indeed the paintings as well. But I think there are some paintings already on the website, aren't there? There are some reproductions.
Yeah. There's a section.
And indeed, there's a wonderful, possibly more than one portrait that Joseph Herman did of Mira, one of which we used to advertise this event. So yes, interesting connections. Thank you very much, and good night. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night.